Hi, listeners. It's your host, Daisy, and I'm here to welcome you to episode 96 of the Fire Rescue Wellness Podcast. Couple quick announcements. By the time you listen to this, I will have 6 shifts remaining in my fire service career. I am planning to serve my last day on March 15th, 2024, and I've planned a super fun day at work. We are going to be staffing an entire station with all of our female personnel. So I made a super fun commemorative t-shirts. If you want to join in the fun, I'll put the link in the bio. I would just love it if you do happen to get a t-shirt. If you would take a photo of yourself on March 15th, tag me in social media so I can repost it. Today, my guest is Naomi Spilka. I met Dr. Spilka at the South Metro Fire Women's Leadership Summit almost a year ago, and I was really moved by her presentation. She's a spitball. Spitfire? Fireball? Hell, I don't know. She's amazing, and I just couldn't wait to get her on my podcast and have a conversation. And I know you're going to really enjoy it. So please rate the podcast, share the podcast, and subscribe to the podcast. I would really appreciate all of those things. Have a great day, and thanks for listening. Thank you for joining me on the Fire Rescue Wellness Podcast. I'm your host, AZ. I find the research and resources and then provide the fire service with the so what, now what, to ensure the health and well-being of every member of our profession. Together, let's thrive. Listeners, I have a really exciting guest for you today. I had the honor of meeting Naomi Spilka at the South Metro Fire Rescue Women's Leadership Summit last May. Naomi, welcome to the show. Say hello to the listeners.
Hello to all. I'm really excited to be here. Just a little nervous.
Oh my gosh. Naomi, I just have to tell you, you made such an impression on me. You were one of the other speakers there. And as I was sitting in the audience, I was like, I have to get her on the podcast. So I'm so excited you're here today.
I am too. I actually, I was thinking about you and thinking about this. And I was like, oh God, am I going to come clean to her that now every time I compromise my sleep, I always think to myself, what would Annette think? So you're in my head.
I love it. I love it. If I can be in people's head about sleep, I've had a successful life. We can drop the mic now and, I don't know, go sit on the porch and drink wine. But actually, we should probably have a conversation since you blocked out time. And I'm going to have you kind of introduce yourself the same way I ask all of my listeners to do so. And that's with my 3 magic questions. And so you get to answer this any way you want to. But who is Naomi Spilka?
So this is obviously like the hardest question, I think, for anybody. I'm sure that people say that a lot. I'm a New Yorker, grew up in the tri-state area. My family is all back there for the most part, aside from my grandparents who are here in Colorado and my aunt and uncle. I am Puerto Rican, Jewish, very proudly Jewish. I'm sure that'll come up at another point during this conversation. I'm a stepmom, a wife, a dog mom. I have an English bulldog who's 10 and a half. Pretty passionate about him. I'm a psychologist, definitely a nerd, and I'm an Israeli military veteran.
And you said some of my favorite words already, which included dog mom. So that's usually one of the last questions. So we'll put a pin in that and come back to it.
Sounds good.
So Naomi, what sets your soul on fire?
I would definitely say like education, psychoeducation in particular, but really just like learning things that I didn't know before, or being able to connect dots in an interdisciplinary way. So not just as it relates to psychology, but connecting history and sociology and anthropology and, all of these different disciplines, probably not like more tech stuff and all of that. But I really do believe that we live in this world and have access to everything if we seek it. And so I'm definitely pretty passionate about that. But probably more specific to what I do, I'm super passionate about helping people understand themselves. I love what I do. I work specifically with responders in military and their families and their systems. And really being able to reach people and watch the gears turn and help them connect things in themselves is one of the biggest privileges and the coolest things I can do on a daily basis.
And as a recipient of services, not from you, but from other counselors who have helped me sort of start to know myself, that is just, it's invaluable. And I'm hoping after our conversation today, more first responders will be open to that because it's just such a cool process.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more.
Yeah. And the last question, my dear, how are you changing the world?
This is definitely foundational to who I am as a person, but one individual at a time, which is something of a Jewish principle. So I'm not like a practicing Jew anymore at all, although I was raised pretty religious. But foundationally, I really do believe that if you there's a saying, if you save a soul, you save a generation. And I really believe that when I just sit with one person, or if I'm giving a training, if there's one person who walks away with something meaningful to them in their life, I've done my job. And that might sound like I'm setting the bar pretty low, which maybe I am, but I take it really seriously.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit more? Because when you change one person, you change a generation. I want to hear more about that.
Yeah. I mean, for me, I mean, in some ways, I actually think maybe somebody has more knowledge on this than myself, but I honestly think it's from like a trauma foundation, like as a people, right? Like one person, you need one to save one person in order to be able to continue and thrive and come out of trauma and loss and all of those things. So probably an intergenerational trauma component to this principle. I'm not exactly sure where it originated. But just for me, I'm obviously overeducated and like very definitely like never achieving enough, unfortunately, in some ways. But I would definitely say that for me, it keeps me focused on what's really important and what's in front of me, and really makes me value every moment that I get to spend with people, and really invest in them.
I really love that concept, and I'm just going to let that simmer for a second. What you said, the moments you get to invest in people, because I
Yeah.
sometimes think that, actually, I think that we sometimes don't think that when we're having moments with people, we're making an investment in them and ourselves. So that's a
For
cool
sure.
concept.
Well, yeah, I mean, and even from a giving perspective, right? Like just making sure that for any person who's in a giving profession, which, if it's only firefighters on this podcast, or listening, I'd be surprised. But at the end of the day, when we give, we need to remind ourselves that we are expending resources, we are investing in somebody. And sometimes we don't even feel like we have so much control over that. We just give, and we give because in that moment we're so present, and we're so dedicated. But we also just need to remind ourselves that on the other side of that, we're being depleted. And I'd love to say that I'm really good at catching myself and not being depleted, but I'm not. I'm really terrible at it.
I think that's just a hazard of our profession. It feels
Yeah.
like that's a very common theme. Well, what I would like to invite you to do, because you do very powerful things with first responders and military now, but when we were at the Women's Summit, you did tell your story and how you got to where you are. And I would love to have you elaborate as much or as little on kind of your history that brought you to your profession.
Mm-hmm. I mean, definitely, I wouldn't be doing what I do, working with the population that I work with, if it weren't for my military service. I know that that's like a political landmine right now, and is a really tough topic, which I'm not even gonna begin to go into at all. But at the end of the day, what that gave me is really just an understanding of systems and how they affect people. And in particular, really, what it is to be a woman in the world and what it is to be a woman surrounded by men, not knocking men by any means, but just the loneliness and the challenges and the never good enoughs and the always feeling like there's something to prove, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then just holistically, really just thinking about leaving that system and trying to re-enter the world and connect with people and the challenges that come with that. So truly, when I got out of the military, my focus was on veterans and the military population, specifically military-related trauma, not necessarily combat trauma, although also, but just generally trauma that oftentimes goes overlooked, and things that women experience, in particular, just on more of a personal note, that don't fall under MST or military sexual trauma, just some of the other peripheral challenges that absolutely get into us, get into our cores, and truly challenge us throughout our lifetimes. And then also thinking about how that extends to other minority populations within these environments as well. And I just sort of in school got obsessed with systems, internal systems, just, even within a dyad, a couple or a friendship or parent-child relationship, and then families, and then, systems within systems. And ultimately, long story short, but found my way to working with responders, definitely through connection and fire. And, fire is really interesting from a familial standpoint, the culture that exists. And I don't only work with fire, I work with many different populations within the responder world. And ultimately just sort of landed, and I landed for a lot of reasons. I landed at Code 4. I landed with this specific community here in Colorado. And quite frankly, I always joke, and this, goes into like, I guess maybe a different pocket of my life, but I always joke that if I wasn't doing this, I'd be a psychologist in jail, which is where I did most of my training. And it was sort of strange, but also sort of felt like I landed there as well.
That's incredible. And I'm really interested if we could dig a little bit more. As a woman in the fire service, I'm almost finished with my career. I have 6 more shifts to go, and I'm really excited to be finished with it. I know.
Oh, I have so many questions for you that probably aren't appropriate for right now. But
my God, you can bounce them back if you want to. But there were some really hard times for me, and I don't think that all the time people were making it intentionally hard. I do know that sometimes people were they just wanted to give me a hard time, but I don't think that was the case all the time. And I think that a good majority of males in the fire service want to know, how can we be more inclusive? How can we treat them how they want to be treated? Can you dig into that a little bit so that maybe the men out in the audience will have some understanding?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you. I actually think that the amount of times that there's an intentional point to harm or deter is minimal. I mean, maybe, as someone else could probably call me naive, but I actually don't think that the vast majority of individuals in the world want to make women's jobs harder or existences more difficult. And I really operate from that perspective. But I think that the stigmas and the implicit biases, and also just people's relationships with women. And also, I think it's really important to just highlight, and this is not a topic that gives me any joy, but women make women's lives more difficult too. And I don't know if you've talked about that on this podcast before, what sorts of conversations that looks like, but it is something that obviously exists in the world. And I think that we don't talk enough about. And so what I would say is, and in some ways, I actually would wonder if those relationships, when women make women's lives more difficult, if that is more intentional. And again, this is something I've thought a lot about, but it's not happy for me to think about. I wish that weren't the case, but I have a lot of potential theories on why that might be. But ultimately, I think that in terms of inclusivity, it's a matter of just foundational empathy. I don't think that this has to do with, I think that, and I want to be somewhat careful here because I don't want to be misunderstood. I know it may be something I shouldn't be worried about, but I think that there's so many ways that we can look at, whether it's bias or discrimination, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that it's not so much about looking at somebody as the other, as looking at them as yourself. And that's what I mean really by empathy. So I'm not saying that we don't see color, we don't see gender, we don't see, any of these things. We have to see those things. It's important for us to see those things, to honor them, to respect them. But in this concept, and I feel like such an academic saying it this way, but in this concept of like self versus other, we inherently as human beings are wired to understand an other as outside of ourself or different. And, that's a biological survival mechanism in us, whether we want it or not. And we have to do a lot of work in order to combat that. But part of that work is exposure. And if we can be exposed, so not just, let's just say in this circumstance, reject women and say, no, you can't be a part of this, but rather say, hey, I actually want you to be a part of this. And I want to get curious about your experience. And I want to actually focus on how I can relate to you other than how you're different than me. And that could be something as simple as, let's take a stereotype. Women are physically weaker than men. Let's just take that stereotype. Rather than looking at a woman as a smaller stature, all of these things that visually maybe identify us or out us, but rather looking at when was a time when I needed physical help. And how did that make me feel? Or what sort of help would I have wanted and who would I have wanted it from? And I get that there's a lot of processing there. There's a lot that has to happen. But I guess the bottom line is just, how is this person similar to me? How can I relate to them?
So looking for where we can meet in commonality as opposed to what is so different. That's really, really smart. So you work primarily with first responders and military. And one of the things that I try so hard to do is bring awareness to the fact that firefighters struggle, as do police officers and military members. And there's a lot of reasons. I think perhaps they aren't adequately prepared for the job. The sleep deprivation certainly doesn't help. And in my opinion, we see things that probably we shouldn't be seeing. But as a support person for first responders, can you start to give some advice to, say, someone that's brand new and coming into their career? How can they perhaps make themselves a little more resilient during their career?
Oof, this sort of gets into one of my pedestals. You didn't realize it, I'm sure. But
is it a good pedestal or a bad pedestal?
I don't know. I guess you'll have to evaluate that. But to sort of indirectly answer your question, I've thought a lot about like sort of this chicken and the egg, right? Like who actually, is it the job that quote unquote fucks people up, or is it that people come in who have certain life experiences, not that they're fucked up, but that they have certain life experiences that make them gravitate toward, I don't know, chaos, maybe because they're familiar with it. So, there's an interesting conversation there. But what do we know about resilience? What we know about resilience is flexibility. It's the ability to adapt. And so if we really want to understand, let's say for somebody who's in academy and has never had a responder job before, if we really want to understand or help them understand how they can be successful, they have to ask themselves to give themselves essentially examples of times when they adapted and they adapted well, and maybe times when they resisted adaptation, when they resisted change, when they resisted growth. And those are big conversations for people to have. especially with themselves. And especially, if we're looking at a stereotypical demographic of a younger responder, someone who's earlier in their life, developmentally, those are not appropriate necessarily, like appropriate questions for someone to start asking themselves, because in some ways, they require wisdom, they require reflection, they require a lot of internal work. Now, I've met people in their early 20s, and I would not count myself in this, who have done that work and are remarkable and have done a lot of it, and keep, a massive door open to any and all opportunities that they can continue doing that work throughout their lifetime. But I would really say that if you want to succeed, you need to manage your expectations, which I'll go into in a second, of yourself, but you need to be able to acknowledge where you came from and and how you became the person that you are. If you can look yourself in the mirror and you can say, like, I don't actually think I've faced adversity, or I have faced adversity and I actually have not stood up to the challenge, I would say before you go into this line of work, you have a lot of work to do, to keep yourself safe so you can be successful in this job. But I also think it's really important not to minimize, and I hear this often, not to minimize the experiences that people have. It doesn't mean that you have to go through an extreme amount of trauma in order to be ready for this career. It doesn't mean that you have to have overcome, barrier after barrier, in your lifetime up to that point. What it means is that you have to be able to look at how you've grown and how you've adapted, and honor that and use it as a foundation to how you can continue to do that throughout your job and throughout your career. And then when I said, like, managing expectations, what I really mean is we have to, this is where education and psychoeducation, I think, comes in. We have to understand what's normal. We have to understand a normal stress response. We have to understand a normal trauma response. We have to understand that when you are, God, the inventory of screwed up traumatic situations that I have in my head, right? Like you are, doing CPR on a dead body, right? Like these horrible situations. You're not supposed to just be okay after that. Like, it's okay if you are, your resilience system is working. You've probably got a mechanism in there, but you got to be reasonable with yourself about your humanity, because the feelings that come up after that are you as a human showing up, a hero versus human. Well, tough shit. Sometimes it's both. You can be, not sometimes, it's always both. If you can be a hero and you can be a human simultaneously, and one isn't weaker than the other, one isn't stronger than the other. And if we separate them, then we're just perpetuating the stigma. And so I really just think that people need to learn. They need to learn about themselves. They need to learn about, like where they come from. But then they also need to just educate themselves and normalize and be kind to themselves. Because being hard on ourselves when we're willingly responding to things that nobody should willingly respond to, and then we're saying we didn't do it well enough, or we cried after, is come on, it's ridiculous to me. But but when I sit in rooms with people, I can't necessarily say that, so I'll say it here. You got to be nice to yourself, and you have to cut yourself a lot of slack. And if you don't, it's just going to perpetuate the resistance to change and the shutting down, as opposed to the growth and the flexibility.
I would love for you to talk more about those individuals who sort of crave chaos or chase chaos. And what does that exactly mean? I think I know what you mean, but I would love for you to dig in.
We gravitate to what's familiar to us. It's part of being an animal. It's part of being a human being. And this isn't something that we're aware of. Chances are we only become aware of it when it becomes a problem, because quite frankly, that's what natural adaptation is. But for people who have, whether it's trauma or high stress, we could, split hairs with what all of these things mean to every individual person. What are the behaviors that are familiar to us? And if we're talking about behaviors, the behavior of running toward a fire, whatever that fire is, the behavior of running toward, relational conflict because you know how to navigate it. What are we running toward? What are we seeking out? What makes us feel competent? If I have survived, let's say 25 years of chaos, whether that's, I grew up in a war zone, or I had a really tumultuous upbringing for one reason or another. If I know how to navigate chaos, if I know how to survive, I might not know how to thrive, and I might not know what's safe, because the only thing that I know to be safe is my ability to get through these things and come out the other side. But there's no peace in that. And so I think it's really important for us to be honest with ourselves. And I say this having gone into a military and now again being part of the responder community, which at the end of the day, I am to a certain extent. You know, why do we feel so comfortable in chaos? Why does chaos and, coming out the other side of that, whatever that time frame looks like, why does that make us feel like ourselves or competent in our lives, or like we've achieved something? When I did work in jail, and I specifically say jail because I think this was when I put the pieces together for myself, but in particular, working with the women I worked with, there was this inability to have peace, and I started to realize that for people who are familiar with chaos, not that they necessarily, I wouldn't say, there are people that thrive in chaos. I think that that's so unfair of a statement. But for people who know chaos and it's really the only thing that's familiar to them, when there isn't chaos, it's just a void. And for some, it might be boring. And for some, it might be terrifying. And we need to be able to identify for ourselves, is it boredom that I experience when I'm not in a chaotic situation, or I'm not running toward a fire? Or am I terrified because who am I and how do I exist in the world? And how do I matter if I'm not just perpetually going through these cycles? And quite frankly, that's identity work. And I am saying all of this, but at the end of the day, I'm still sitting in the middle of it. And, being still is, anyone who knows me, and I can hear my husband like both laughing, but also not laughing. Like, for those of us who struggle with that stillness, there are a lot of hard questions in that space.
As you were talking, I was brought back to a memory. It's kind of, I guess you would call it a pivotal memory. I don't know if that's the right word, but this person has long since retired. But I remember he was kind of a lazy individual, and he didn't have a lot of interest on going on calls. He'd be frustrated when the tones went off. But I remember if it was a chaos call, a decapitation, a gunshot wound, a train wreck, he would get out of the chair so fast, even if our crew wasn't due. And he would be running towards the engine saying, we should take that call. And finally, I asked him one day, I said, why in the world would you want to go on that call? You don't want to go on any calls. And he said, well, I think I can handle it better than the other people. And I was just floored. And to this day, I think about that. And I think about the fact that in that moment, I probably should have tried to get him some help. I think that was a failure on my part.
Well, I mean, we can't, and listen, I say this with my job being my job, but I tell people this, I supervise peer support teams as well. And I tell all my peer supporters this. I mean, you can't help somebody that, first of all, doesn't want help, right? Like, just from a legal perspective, a clinician can't see someone if they don't consent to treatment outside of, involuntary commitment, all of that stuff. But I mean, there's that component, but I would even go, a step further and potentially a step deeper and say, if somebody feels that they belong in that space, and I hear a protector in there, but I actually would challenge that. And I would say, there's a little ego there. Like, I can handle it better than somebody else, which we all have. I feel that too. I'm like, well, why would I give it to that person if I can do it? And I feel like I can do it better. I think we all have that to a certain extent, but that's our every human being has narcissistic features, and that's part of narcissism, right? It's us saying like I can do it better than somebody else, when quite frankly that's just a belief. There's no truth to that. But in your example, I know this guy, right? I don't know this specific person, but I know this guy. I know this person that feels that they belong in those places, that doesn't feel like they belong anywhere else in the world. And this is something that people are so hesitant to speak openly about, because how screwed up is it? How screwed up am I that the only place that I feel I belong is at a decapitation call? Like, whoa. But there are people who in this field especially, and in the military community as well, who that is where they feel they belong, and they don't feel they belong anywhere else in the world, any other existence. And it's terrifying. It's terrifying for the people that care about them, because what happens when they don't have it anymore? But I really wonder just how terrifying it is for them to even think about what that means once they're not a responder anymore.
Yeah, that didn't occur to me. I didn't even think about that till just now. I can't decide which direction I want to go first. So let me just ask you this.
Yeah.
I became aware of some of the research on adverse childhood experiences a few years ago. And I know that there's, varying opinions on whether this really causes people to perhaps seek careers in the military or police and fire. Can you elaborate for the listeners kind of what are the adverse childhood experiences, and what are at least your feelings in your practice about them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the ACEs. So if anyone's interested, you can literally just Google ACEs, ACE test. It's 10 questions, and you can take it for yourself. But it essentially just evaluates, early childhood experience or adverse early childhood experiences and events. Things like being in a home where there was domestic violence, or experiencing, or having I think one of them is having a parent be incarcerated. So things like that. I actually am like not super versed on the research about ACEs. I'm definitely familiar with them. But I would say that, again, from a resilience perspective, like we have to have faced adversity to know that we can do it. And so I actually had an interesting conversation. I'm 3 days a week at a police department here in-house. And I had an interesting conversation with one of the officers about who's coming, who the new recruits are, right? Who's this new generation? And I'm certain that there are people listening, and maybe for yourself too, you've heard, if not, also experiencing these thoughts, these feelings of how are these kids going to make it? They all seem so soft. Which I think is, I understand where people are coming from, but let's give them a chance. We need to learn, there are things we can learn, right? But ultimately, I think that you need to have thick skin. And the only way that you have thick skin is if you've been through some shit. And so I actually would say that it's less about the actual adverse childhood events. I say this therapy and personal challenges are totally different categories. So I'm just speaking professionally here and being an effective responder. I think that it's less about the specific ACEs or adverse early childhood events that people have, and more about how they've gotten through them and how they've grown from them. And so when I say gotten through them, what I really mean is, was there a support system, or was there, one person that they looked up to, and they could, could sort of act as a guiding light, oh, that person did it, so I can do it too. Was there a safe space? So for some people, that might be faith, and I've heard that often is the only thing that they had was the church or a faith community in some sort of way, and. Or was it really just that somebody actually thrived by themselves and they actually did a really good job sort of shutting the rest of the world out and trucking, just kind of keeping their eye on the prize, whatever that was. And maybe we can call that grit. I'm not sure. That just that trait of perseverance, and there's passion component to that too. Um, but I just, I think that again, like I already said this, but we just need to be honest with ourselves about how we actually got through those things. And did we just survive, or did we actually give ourselves to thrive out of it? And for a lot of people, it doesn't like sit well to say that, I actually thrived coming out of my trauma. Like there's discomfort there. Maybe there's pride for some, but it's also like, no, like fuck my trauma. Like I didn't deserve that. I had to survive it. I didn't have a choice. And so why am I going to give it the credit to let me now actually thrive? But that's what we call post-traumatic growth, which actually half to 3/4 of people actually experience without necessarily any therapeutic intervention. They just that's their resilience that comes out of it. So that's really, if anyone wants to better understand themselves and maybe more of a relationship between ACEs and how they're doing, if they are actually doing well, I think in the middle of that space is post-traumatic growth.
I love it. I really love that perspective. You also mentioned that you supervise peer support teams, and I think this is the ever elusive, everyone wants to do it right. Everyone wants to get it right. And some people just don't know how to get started. Can you give us tidbits, information, give us what you can on peer support?
Oh man.
Nothing like a wide open question and being a really good host.
No, I mean it's an interesting question. So I mean, I've been at the beginning of peer support teams and helped build them and helped select individuals and all of that. Peer support is like no joke. I think that some people like, or some departments, they're like, let's build a team to support our people. Like, yeah, and also you're already a responder, and also you probably give in other places in your life. So it's in a lot of ways it's a heavy lift because of that, but it's an emotionally heavy lift. And I am the first person to say that as much as I would love to say that, for the teams that I have been with since the beginning and helped select people, that every single person was a good fit and every single person has knocked it out of the park, that is definitely not true. Because I think that people they don't realize that if you have not done therapeutic work, I actually just don't think that not literal therapeutic work sitting with a therapist, but there are lots of different ways to do therapeutic work. But I think that if you're aware, which most people are, that you've got some stuff, and peer support is another way to avoid it. You're in for a rude awakening. So that's sort of my first disclaimer, I guess. But for departments that either want to build one or they want to augment theirs, I guess a few foundational components. It's really important to be organized, and the core of peer support is confidentiality. So really, those two pieces. You need, when I say organize, I mean you need a team lead who is truly loved, I think, and trusted by the vast majority of people. If there's going to be a person that's a face, like they need to be somebody who truly is who is respected professionally, is trusted, and people generally speaking, like know, right? They've been through some stuff with them. They've been on the department a long time, et cetera, et cetera. So you need that piece. And then as it relates to building a team, sort of the same foundation. You need people who professionally are respected. That goes a really long way. If you have people on a team that aren't professionally respected, people are not like a lot of in a lot of environments, people aren't going to go to them, even with that piece. Um, and some teams have both professional staff, so maybe they're not sworn or they're not on the line or whatever it is. And for the sake of this conversation, I'm not necessarily talking about those when I say professionally respected, although, yeah, of course, there's that piece. But also, I think that you need people who know boundaries. You need people who are very comfortable leaving an open door and depersonalizing. We talked earlier, or just mentioned that the concept of like you can't make somebody get help. And so often I hear that people felt bullied by peer support, like they had to get help or else. Which that's not the point of peer support. The point of peer support is I have an open door. You walk through it whenever you want. My door is open. You walk through it whenever. I don't care if that's 3 o'clock in the morning, 5 years from now. It's not about me. It's about the other person and them getting their needs met when they, as their highest authority, determine that they need their needs met. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't express concern. I only walked into a therapy office because basically my father begged me to after the Army, right? Like we need people that love us to tell us like you deserve better than the life that you're living right now. We need that, but that's all we can do. And there's a natural human there's this concept of reactance, which is like, you tell your kid to clean their room and they tell you to go, pound sand. It's the natural rejection, because when we tell somebody to do something, we essentially take away their power and control, their autonomy. And so what we really need to do is just leave that door open, and we need to let somebody know that we love them and we accept them as they are, whether that's now or whether that's in the future, and that they deserve better for themselves. And if a team at the end of the day can communicate that while also providing things like resources, know your resources, know who's available in your community for you to bring people to. If you have one inpatient hospitalization setting, know who works there, know who to contact to get somebody hooked into services. Make sure that you have those connections. And that's in more of an extreme circumstance, of course. But it's also just about outreach. You have to have people who are comfortable outreaching, checking in on people in a really normal, comfortable, organic way, just because they care. And lots of times, and this is probably the best thing for people who are looking to start teams or to build their teams, you want to pick people that anyway people go to and go to consistently. Like that's the low hanging fruit is, hey, everyone goes to John Smith. Maybe we should ask John Smith if he would like to be a part of this. So that's a good place to start. I'm not sure if I really answered that question. I sort of went all over the place.
No, that was really good. And it made me think of two things. First off, is there sort of a magic ratio, like 1 to 10? Meaning, if you have a department of 200 people, should you have 15 or 20 peer supporters or 5? Is there a magic number?
I don't necessarily think there's a magic number. I am more, this is sort of a cliche, but it's about quality, not quantity. Especially if you're just building a team, I would say absolutely start small. Even if you're a 200, your 200, person department, start with 3 people that work really well together. That's very small, but if you're just going to get certain, like there's a lot of research, I think that teams don't do. So maybe this is a good thing to say. Like, I think that if you have, let's say 3 people who work really well together, use that time not to start doing your outreach, not to start showing up on critical incidents. Like if you can, and you have the bandwidth to do that, I think that that's a beautiful thing. But I think that in a lot of ways, it's way more important to get the foundation of the resources that are available. and start building those relationships. Have clinicians in your community that you trust, that are culturally competent, that you can provide warm handoffs with. Know the EAP providers. Who you can refer people to. Understand how to navigate psychology today and finding providers for people, and specifically the things that they need. There's so much background work that I think teams could benefit from. I would say start small, start slowly, have clinical guidance, which is somebody like me, a licensed clinician who you can float things to. But also just from a wellness coordination, like I think it creates such a better foundation for the longevity of the team if you start small and you just focus on building that foundation of resources.
Base of the pyramid first. That makes a lot of sense.
100%.
Okay, so I have one more like real legit question, and then we're going to get to the dogs. Are you okay on time?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I've been wildly concerned about an individual in this space. He is trying very hard to help everyone, and in fact publishes publicly his phone number, like, call me anytime, day or night. And I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, this is a recipe for disaster. So can you speak just a little bit to the people who are already out there, who are peer supporters, who really, really want to help and are doing things like that maybe ultimately are going to backfire on them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, this is a boundary issue, but it also, I think, is an avoidance issue, and I think that those go hand in hand for a lot of different reasons. So just from a boundaries perspective, like what this person is essentially communicating to the world is like, I don't know when to stop. I don't know where the limit is. I'm willing to stretch myself as thin and humanly possible, in the name of helping others, in the name of being available. But what I think you are probably noticing, and I'm sure others notice as well, is first of all, that's impossible, right? Like something's gonna fall through. They're setting themselves up for failure. They're gonna let somebody down because they're just gonna be stretched too thin. But then also it's, to me as a clinician, I think, why are they trying so hard? Like, why are they communicating such emptiness that you reach out to me because that will fill me up? And of course that's not intentional, right? Like the intention, I do truly believe, is good, but ultimately that's where that avoidance component comes in. What am I avoiding? That I'm essentially, using the opportunity, I'm capitalizing, and that's like such a provocative way of putting it, but I'm capitalizing on people struggling to help me feel like I matter more, or to fill, there's this term in psychology, to fill this bucket that I am, that really just has a hole in it, a bucket with a hole in it, which I think is, can be a really difficult thing for some people to realize about themselves, is that not only do they feel empty, but that, the second there's an element of fulfillment, it's just gone and it's never enough. And so ultimately, detaching from that sort of role, or detaching from being available to those people, means that person is turning around and just gaping over the edge of this massive void that they don't even know how to begin to fill. And so if we take this to more of an extreme, I get very concerned about people choosing life at that point. And that can get very scary, and can get very scary very quickly. But those red flags that you're identifying, like I feel so much care from you there. But the truth is that as much care as there might be there, there's for me, like there's a tremendous amount of fear as well for that person, because if they don't have that anymore, what are they going to do?
Mm-hmm. You have so eloquently verbalized all of the thoughts that were banging around in my head. So thank you for that.
Of course.
Well, this has been an awesome conversation. I've been looking forward to it for so long, and I want to make sure to not only be respectful of your time, but also leave just a moment to talk about your dog.
Puppies.
Yeah.
Of
So
course.
tell me all of the information about Fire Rescue Wellness Loves the dogs.
All of the dogs. I can send you a picture of him. His name is
Please.
Bullseye. He's a 10-and-a-half-year-old English bulldog. He's actually like right on the other side of this wall over here, in a cone, because he decided to take a chunk out of his cornea, and then like had to have all of these eye procedures and all of these things. He's actually doing really well. But some of the coolest, most fun things about Bullseye, I think, is I get to take him to work with me. So I take him to the police department. He gets hair everywhere, but I mean, he's just, he's an English bulldog. He's got like, a bunch of rolls and a really fat head that, quite frankly, operates as something of like an anxiety blanket. And so, he's like this weighted, seriously. And, people come in, it's sort of manipulative of me because I have them there and people come in and I get to check in with them. They don't do that just to check in with me. A lot of them, not everyone, but a lot of them really do wait for Bullseye to be there. But he's not a registered therapy dog. He's not even an emotional support dog. I take him to work because people are obsessed with him and he makes them feel more comfortable. He's disgusting. He farts all the time, but
does he have sleep apnea?
No, he doesn't. He actually is not like he like snores, but he's not like super like flat-nosed dog. He doesn't have like so many of their issues. He's not like that gross. But I will tell you that I tell people all the time, like, if you don't need me, which you might not need me, I don't want people all the time. I just want him. And so kick me out of my office. If he's who you want, kick me out. Let me know that you want the door closed. There's a therapy session going on. And when I need my office, I will come back and knock on the door. I've had people who like literally won't leave because all they want is to like feel him and pet him. And he gives them comfort and makes them happy. And quite frankly, after some pretty hard sessions, he'll just rip a big fart and people finally start laughing or they're crying or whatever it is. And I know it sounds ridiculous, but I have seen people who refuse to cry in my office break into tears simply because he's made them laugh. And quite frankly, like, that's not my job. I'm not doing that. Like, it's just the power of an animal and normal being normal, I guess.
My friend Christina has a pity, and he's kind of the same. Like, he's got this big block head, but she has a podcast, and oftentimes I can hear him snoring in the background of the podcast. So, well, Naomi, this has been a glorious conversation. I know that you were a little bit hesitant, and man, you are a rock star. You kicked ass. So
I appreciate it. This is really fun. I appreciate you. I appreciate the opportunity. I hope that, right, if one person listens and maybe walks away with something meaningful, I won't hear about it probably, which is totally good, but I'll just tell myself that that's happening. But you do that with this all the time, every episode. So thank you for the work that you're doing.
Well, thank you. And I should have asked you, like, way at the outset, can you work with people out of the state of Colorado remotely or not?
No. So from a legal standpoint, there are like there's this thing called PsyPack, which here's a resource for people. Okay. There's this thing called PsyPack, which if you're a psychologist and you're registered through it, you actually can see people in states that are also PsyPack registered. I am not a member of it because I don't have to be. I actually just today had to tell somebody I can't take new people, which I always just like is really, really a hard thing. But at the end of the day, like, just for anybody, if you're looking for a clinician, specifically, like, that's private pay, so it can be pretty expensive. But if you're looking for a clinician and they are in PsyPack, or they're just registered in another state. So I have a friend who lives in Arizona, is registered in Minnesota. And there are a lot of people like that who have some of those multi licenses. You can do that, but I personally am only registered in Colorado.
Okay, well, I'm gonna grab that SciPac. I'll grab the contact information from you off air, and I'll put that in the show notes.
Oh,
and
good.
I think we can drop the mic. So
Wonderful.
This has been AZ and Naomi Spilka, and we are officially out.